So dear students, we are here with chapter on the face of it, class 12 English Core. So let's start. Susan Hill is the author of this chapter. Susan Hill was born on 5th February 1942 in Scarborough, England. She is an English author of fiction and non-fiction works, and her first novel, The Enclosure, was published in 1961 when she was still a student. She worked as a freelance journalist between 1963 and 1968, publishing her third novel, Gentlemen and Ladies, in 1968. She became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 1972 and was a presenter of BBC Radio 4's Bookshelf. And what is the objective of this chapter? This is a one-act play, and here you are going to learn the appreciation of play as a powerful medium of communication reformation. It is to develop the communication skills between Derry and Mr. Lamb, and here we are appreciating the values of patience, positive attitude and courage. So what is there in the chapter? The play depicts two individuals, and who are those? Mr. Lamb and Derry, who meet unfortunate odds but develop different attitudes while facing those odds. The two persons are Derry, a young acid attack victim who was not internally victimized. He had a burnt face. And Mr. Lamb, a much older man who lost his limb in a blast. So he was lame. Though through the contrast in the outlook of both the survivor, the author tries to create a tale of overcoming odds and seemingly insurmountable difficulties and retaining hope in the ability to find happiness. That how can we overcome the issues in our life, the problems, and how the ray of hope bring happiness in our life. So here Mr. Lamb worked as a mentor and guide to Derry. So this play depicts beautifully yet grimly the sad world of the physically impaired. It is not the actual pain or inconvenience caused by a physical impairment that trouble a disabled man, but the attitude of the people around him. So two physically impaired people, Mr. Lamb with a tin leg and Derry with a burnt face, strike a band of relationship. Though Derry was not physically impaired, his outlook was only changed because he had only burnt face. Derry is described as a young boy, shy, withdrawn and defiant. So what is the theme? The theme of the chapter is positive attitude towards life. Sub-theme, facing the most uninvited challenges of life. The plot, that means the overall glimpse of the story. Derry's seclusion. He did not like anyone, he did not have friends. Mr. Lamb and his garden, he visited Mr. Lamb's garden one day. Then how Mr. Lamb succeeds in changing Derry. He gave him examples from the nature. Mr. Lamb's lamentation, his death, Derry's mother and the society at large, that what was the role of Derry's mother in motivating him towards life. And finally Derry was changed. He was able to recognize himself and he decided to go back to Mr. Lamb. But the sad part was that Mr. Lamb was no more. So, who are the characters? There are two characters. Derry, a boy of 14 with a burnt face, looks ugly, loner, secluded. He was pessimistic because he did not want to play with his friends. Especially he did not have many friends. He suffered from severe negative complexes, anger, that means he was underconfident. He was suffering from anger and frustration also due to all these issues. He was withdrawn and introverted. low confidence, indulge in self pity, suspicious of the intent of others. Now, what about Mr. Lamb? He was an old man with a tin leg. He was lonely, craved for company and acceptance. He was jovial, happy. He was optimistic. That means positive attitude towards life. He was lover of nature, social. As he said that he has so many friends, outgoing, tolerant, helpful, sensitive, independent, didn't mind children calling him lamey lamb or picking the crab apples. Now, what are the key points? Especially Mr. Lamb's garden, that how he was an admirer of nature, then Dairy's entry, conversation between them, and the examples by Mr. Lamb for Dairy, Mr. Lamb's personality and Mr. Lamb's hospitality, Dairy's defiance, Dairy's perception about others. Mr. Lamb revives the almost dead feelings of Dairy towards life. Dairy's face burned by acid, he motivates him to think positively about life. How kids tease Mr. Lamb, but he was not defined by them and he was just doing his task. Leg blown off in air, his positive attitude towards life, everything appears to be the same but is different. For example, the weed's garden, the story of the beauty and the beast. These two examples were given by Mr. Lamb to Dairy to motivate him towards life. So, what are those two examples especially? The story of the beauty and the beast and weed's garden. Now, the next few pointers. Dairy's concern, people fussing, showing pity, so he did not want to make friends with them. Motivation by Mr. Lamb. He gave the example of buzzing bees, that few people like the buzzing of bees and few sound it like a music. Accepting realities of life, not paying heed to gossip. Dairy influenced by Mr. Lamb's peculiar sayings. Dairy's acceptance of Mr. Lamb's friendship. Story of the fear-stricken man who locked himself. Mr. Lamb continues to motivate Dairy. Dairy's liking for Mr. Lamb, and finally he decided to go and take permission from his mother and come back. Mr. Lamb's views on those who come to his garden. Mr. Lamb's emphasis on the consequence of hatred. Acid ruined Dairy's face, hatred would ruin his life. How Mr. Lamb enjoyed himself listening and watching. So, there are few more points. Dairy's affiliation to Mr. Lamb. Dairy leaves for home finally. Dairy is inspired and promises to come back. But Mr. Lamb was lonely at the time. Dairy's mother warns him about his visit to Mr. Lamb's garden. Dairy comes back to the garden. Mr. Lamb found dead. When he searches a new foothold to live happily, he finds Mr. Lamb dead. So, that is again the sad part of the story. In this way, the play depicts the heart-rending life of physically disabled people with their loneliness, aloofness, and